All right, I think we will get started, and other participants will just join us when they can. I just I'm mindful of not running behind schedule, and we've got a lot that we want to cover in the next few hours. So yeah, let's just get started. Welcome everyone. My name is Noelle Garcin. And I would like to welcome you to this webinar on making South Africa's climate change gender sensitive. I work at the Embassy of France in South Africa, and I am a co-host of this event together with UN Women, DIRCO, the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities, the African Climate, the Women Leadership Training Program, Gender CC, and the African Climate Alliance. So this is a joint event that we are very happy to have you attending. And I'm very pleased to welcome representatives from national departments as well, in particular Ms. Zandile Bengu from DIRCO, Mr. Tivulawi Mukwebo from the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities. We've got also Ms. Punanani Muremi from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. We've got Anne Gituku Shongwe, who is the UN Women representative here in South Africa. And we also have our partners from various civil society organizations who are joining on this event. Amy Gilliam from the African Climate Reality Project, Sibongile Mtungwa from the Women Leadership and Training Program, Bertha Chiro from Gender CC, and Gabriel Klassen from the African Climate Alliance. So thank you very much all for being here today, and for joining this discussion on climate justice and gender and feminist action. I also just want to, as a contextual information, want to inform you that this is an event that we organize under the Generation Equality campaign, and we will tell you a bit more about this, so I'm not going to expand on this. I just wanted, as an opening remark, to highlight why we invited this discussion on gender equality, feminist action, and climate justice. I think many of you would know that climate justice recognizes that the drive for environmental sustainability is inextricably linked with social justice and gender equality. Climate justice centralizes the needs of people who are the most marginalized. Those are the ones who rely on natural resources to ensure their livelihoods, take care of their families, and are most impacted by environmental degradation and natural disasters. And this is why gender equality and climate action intersect. And we will have, I think, a few presentations and testimonies to that during this webinar. We will also see that critical constraints to gender equitable climate action continue to persist, and they have actually worsened in the aftermath of COVID-19. We've seen that there are deeply entrenched gender roles and reduced access to natural resources, which have meant that women and girls are most exposed to climate risks, and they are less empowered to drive solutions due to legal and economic insecurity. So this is just to kind of frame the discussion to say this is a very important topic that we would like to discuss with all the participants today. We've built the event on partially on a report that was published in 2020 by the African Climate Reality Project, the South African Institute of International Affairs, and the South Durban Community Environmental Alliance. This report is called A Gendered Lens, Mainstreaming Gender into South Africa's Climate Change Response. We did circulate the link to the report, which is available online. So I don't know if any of you had the chance to have a look at it, but we will have an overview of the report findings and recommendations presented today. And this will also feed into the discussions we would like to have. Just as a snippet, the report does make clear that as it stands now, South Africa's response to climate change is at risk of exacerbating existing inequalities. And this is because it is not taking gender into account, at least not sufficiently. The impacts on agriculture, rainfall, and livelihoods will have gendered implications. And still, we find that this is not a well enough known reality, and it's not emphasized enough in South Africa's current climate change response. In the webinar, we will also hear the testimony of someone who's been experiencing the effects of climate change and witnessing them firsthand in the communities. She will also explain how she's working to address it and to build leadership of girls and women from the grassroots on this issue. So just to conclude and to open this webinar, conclude my opening, I'm very happy that we have joining us today representatives of DIRCO, DFFE, and the Department of Women, because they will also take us through some of the policies and initiatives that are focusing on gender and the climate nexus. And I think it's very good also to be informed of what's happening so that we can take this further in our discussions. And this is something we hope to achieve with a panel discussion where we will have various representatives engaging on that. I would like to just remind you of a few house rules as well. And number one is to please keep your microphone muted when you're not speaking. We are expecting a large number of participants. So we would like to manage the discussions and the presentations as efficiently as possible. This is also why I'd like to invite you to post your comments or questions in the chat so that we can manage the Q&A as best as we can. We will take comments and questions from there when we get to the open discussion sessions a bit later on in the webinar. And with that, I would like to give the floor to Anne Gituku from UN Women to take us through some contextual information about generation equality and the Action Coalition on Feminist Action and Climate Justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Noelle, and congratulations to the Feminist Action for Climate Justice Action Coalition South Africa for putting this together. This is really just very impressive. And I just want to greet all our colleagues who are here from the government, from civil society, activists, women in this space of climate justice. This is a special action coalition because it is not one of those that we discuss every single day. Gender-based violence, economic justice, these ones we talk about on a daily basis. But the issue of climate justice is one that is so severe and so impactful, but yet we're not as engaged in it. So I want to congratulate you for pulling this together, for having all our women in this space and organizations who work in this space together. So let me congratulate you. Let me start out by sort of introducing the Generation Action, Generational Equality Forum and the Action Coalition's world to those who might not be very familiar with it. For others who've heard me say this a million times, sorry to bore you, but I tell you, I am sure you will learn one new thing today, I hope. And so just to say that for UN Women, 25 years and now 26 years after the Beijing conference that produced the blueprint for gender equality in 1995, after a review of all 174 country reports, we did a consolidation and looked at that and did a reflection on where we are on gender equality across the world. And what we basically learned is the following. The first is that we've made progress in a couple of areas. We made progress in terms of girls' education. And this is globally. We've made progress in terms of maternal mortality. We've made progress in terms of less discriminatory laws across the world. But even so, today, as we look, there is no single country in the world that does not have some form of discrimination against women. And so we still are, years away from actually reaching a point where discrimination is history. And so when we looked at the 12 critical areas of gender equality in the blueprint that was called the Beijing Platform for Action, we realized that here we are, countries of the world have signed and agreed that by 2030, we will have gender equality behind us. And yet, on all accounts, we are actually 135 years away from gender equality, which means that we needed to do something. We need to do something dramatically different, transformative, something radical really, and revolutionary, if we want to use those words, to be able to actually drive gender equality so that in 9 years, which is 2030, we will actually be able to look back and say, indeed, we did it, and we have expired gender equality in this period. And so this is what the Generation Equality Forum and Generation Equality Campaign was about. For most of our work as the United Nations, we're a multilateral organization, but we mostly do our work in an intergovernmental manner. And so it is with governments in particular. And so, yes, we would be working with the ministry and departments of environment in every country on climate justice. But what we learned is that the change is not going to happen just between governments. That in fact, what we need is a multi-stakeholder platform that is significant, that actually involves and includes everyone. So the first principle behind the generation equality is that we have a very diverse multi-stakeholder platform that involved, and if you had the privilege to participate in the forums that we had in Paris, we really created an intersectional, but also multiple partners, civil society, women human rights defenders, young people, lots and lots of young people who completely challenge the way in which we look at our work on a daily basis. Women's organizations, civil society organizations from all walks of life, and really bringing together the philanthropists and the private sector across each one of these sectors and governments, so that together and collectively we are able to then talk about all our work. Because as you know, Gender CC is doing one thing, the ministry is doing another one, and somebody else is doing something else. But very often we don't quite know what that is. So if we put it all in one pot, what could that look like? And so the core principles of generation equality is multi-stakeholder, it is intersectional, it is feminist leadership at the front. So how do we make sure that we're leading from the front, that women's leadership is everything here, that we're recognizing women in all their diversity and women's leadership at all levels, and that the Action Coalition seeks to transform structures and systems and power that reinforce inequality in terms of gender equality. And so how do we actually create this shift? And so I don't know if I can share my screen, but I thought I would do that just to make it easy for those who haven't been familiar with this work to be able to just see what this action coalitions look like. I'm going to try to increase it, to fill up my page with it. If I can move it up. Second, it's not a PowerPoint, so it doesn't quite fill the space in the way. I don't know how you move this the screen so that it is fully there. No. All right. I think you can see it well enough, right? And so these are the 6 action coalitions that were established. And I know it's busy with lovely pictures, but you don't need to focus so much on that, but to be able to see the 6 action coalitions that were established. And these are the 6 areas that we found that we're lagging despite all the efforts since 1995. Gender-based violence, I don't need to beat this dead horse because you know this story. You know this story in South Africa very, very well. Economic justice and rights. This one is important to highlight because this is one that South Africa is a co-lead for globally. And so South Africa has been shaping, influencing, and framing what the world is discussing on economic justice and rights. Alongside other governments, Mexico, Sweden, Spain, Germany, these are other governments that have been part of the conversation there on economic justice and rights. I believe Tanzania has been joined us. Bodily autonomy and SRHR. Feminist action for climate justice, and I'll come back to that. Technology and innovation for gender equality, feminist movements and leadership. These are the 6 areas that we felt as a collective. When I say we, UN Women convened, we co-hosted with France and Mexico, but we then brought in multiple partners from all these governments, from all these partners that I mentioned, and together identified these 6 areas as the areas that are most important for us to fast track, to focus on, and to really drive for change if we're going to accelerate our gender equality agenda. The 7th one, which is not in this particular collection, is a compact on women, peace and security. This is an area that already has quite a bit of global action, but we felt that given the continuing humanitarian crisis and we've just seen this in Afghanistan, we're seeing this in Haiti, the Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action Compact is a 7th area that we've prioritized as part of this generation equality. So let me move forward now and let's talk about climate justice itself. And I want to see whether it would be useful for you to see what the plan looks like. So feminist action for climate justice. This is an important area. And our vision for success for this is that by 2016, the feminist action for climate justice will have initiated a transition to an inclusive and regenerative green economy that recognizes the interconnectedness of climate change with issues of gender justice and protects and amplifies the voices of grassroots and indigenous communities, including frontline defenders across social and political arenas. I thought it's important to read this as it is. Women and girls in their full diversity equitably and meaningfully participate in decision-making processes at all levels, including in aligning key climate policy instruments with national development plans and developing climate responses that center human rights. Financing institutions and the donor community reframe risk, prioritize women's organizations as priority partners, and are held accountable to shift capital to support resilient societies and transformative investments in gender-just, climate and ecosystem-based approaches. Women and girls in their full diversity equitably access climate finance, technologies and knowledge, and access and control natural resources for management and protection, including through securing land rights and ownership. So that's the vision for success by 2026. And we're saying 2026 because we've broken out the generation equality into a 5-year sprint where we expect that in the next 5 years, we're going to dramatically drive this agenda so that the 4 years that follow up to 2030, or the 5 years actually, because it includes 2026, we will be able to actually achieve that goal that we want to achieve. But that's the vision. And then in terms of the actions, there are, and we can share this, we can put this, and I'm hoping my colleagues who are here can maybe share this in the different platforms so that you can actually get a look at what this looks like. But there were 4 action areas that were identified in terms of climate justice. The first is to increase direct access to financing for gender just climate solutions, especially for women and girls at grassroots level. So this is a very important one. And it is one that, as you know, is not a big area of our investments. And I'm sure for the organizations who work in this space, you know, as we move towards COP, then there's a lot of action and excitement around it. But other than that, this is not an area that generally has high levels of investment. In countries that have high levels of agriculture, that are very active, perhaps there is investments there, but in general, it's not even focusing and investing in the funding of gender just climate solutions. So that's the first one. The second action is to enable women and girls to lead a just transition to an inclusive, circular, regenerative, green economy. So this is about women and girls in decision-making. This is about women leading. This is about environmental governance, having serious engagement with women in leadership roles so that women are shaping the trajectory, the norms, the transitions, and the inclusivity of the circular and regenerative green economies in real ways. So financing is one, ensuring women's leadership is the second one. And the third one is about building the resilience of women and girls to climate impacts, disaster risks, loss and damage, including through land rights and tenure security. I have to share that, you know, yesterday we were having a global meeting, a global town hall at UN Women, and we were engaging with our Haiti office, and they were sharing how, you know, with humanitarian action, so much happens, and it's just about really makes assumptions that everybody has equal access to, even to the humanitarian support that we at the United Nations provide. But unless women's organizations are there, making sure that women have access to the opportunities, those that are best positioned always get the opportunities. So it's about making sure that women are able to access the opportunities that are put on the table, that women have the models and the community resilience that is required. But of course, the most important one here, and the one that we talk about in this country very much, is the issue of land tenure and land tenure security. And we have been very engaged with the country around this, and we provided huge comments and inputs into the land debates and discussions that were happening, including on the, what was the name of it? Land without compensation. Gosh, I've even forgotten the language. And so here we were engaging and making sure that women's organizations were very engaged in this process, but also that when the government puts out opportunities for women, for people to access land, that women have equal and actually equitable access to those land opportunities. And so the fourth one here is about increasing the collection and use of data on the gender environment nexus. How do we make sure that we know the production and consumption, we know what the enabling environment, what's happening in this environment, what's happening in terms of the laws and policies, and that we are indeed creating information that helps us to recognize and understand what is really happening in terms of gender and environment. I think I will stop there because this really gives a summary, and there are some targets that are put on the table that we would look at for the next 5 years, like the proportion of total agricultural population with ownership, the proportion of seats held by women, you know, so we've got specific indicators that are pulled from the SDGs that then become the indicators that are measurable and monitorable as part of the action coalition. So the challenge for us is that in South Africa, we want to be sure that we are engaging in ensuring that this implementation happens, and that we are joining hands with those who have put themselves out. And you can see the countries and the partners that are leaders on this action coalition on the right. And you can see that there are some commitments that were made, collective commitments that were made, that will give us the opportunity to engage closely. And so we should be able to reach out to this. The Gender and Environment Data Alliance will advance gender just climate action. The Action Nexus of Feminist Collective Action for a Just and Healthy Planet. the Gender Just Climate Solutions Scale Fund, the Advancing Gender in the Environment Partnerships. All of these are specific collective commitments that were put on the table for generation equality. And so we'll share this so that you have this and you're able to see how to make sure that you are joining our hands together in driving feminist action for climate justice in South Africa. Thank you. Back to you, Noel.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thanks for giving such an extensive, explanation and background on generation equality. I think, like you highlighted, it's one of the intention is to bring as many people on board as possible and to really build multi-stakeholders coalitions and actions, because not one institution or stakeholder can solve this issue by themselves, and it really takes collaboration. And I think the fact that in this webinar we've got people from various constituencies is also a very encouraging fact towards what we're trying to achieve. I'd like us to move on to our next session, and I will let Nicole introduce it. We will have a short video and then some storytelling around gender and activism on climate action. So Nicole, please, over to you.
Thanks, Noel, and hi everyone. I'm Nicole from the African Climate Reality Project. The video we're about to share was produced by ACRP and Rewild Africa under the Action 24 project. The docuseries is 5 episodes, and each episode focuses on a core theme to the Action 24 project. So those include youth, community, civil society, journalism, and of course, gender. So I'm going to be sharing the gender episode now with everyone, and I think I've said this to Spongile many times since we worked on this project, but thank you again for sharing this story with us, and I hope you all enjoy the video.
The erosion of the soil is the erosion of the soul. I must have been aware of how land changed, but the time I saw how that changed the people, to see that people were crying for what is gone, soil that cannot give anymore. If you want to defend life, the gender-based violence, for an example, bring people back to what they know better and bring back people to what they are. As a girl and as a woman, the main struggle has been always around water. On your way to fetch water, anything could happen. Harassment, rape, the force into relationships, they are rooted in that a girl cannot decide. When you are abducted for a marriage, you get taken to the house of the man and you get raped. If you are a fighting woman, the others hold you. If your virginity is taken, then your pride goes. My grandmother, when that happened to me, she had a final saying, I'm a Christian, we don't allow these kind of things. And it worked. I didn't get to be raped because she came just the following day. She broke all the rules, kicked the door, it flew open, and then she got into the house and then say, you're going out. I'll be always grateful for that. I left and went to stay in Cape Town and hide there for some time. My grandmother, she wrote me such a beautiful letter while I was running away. And she said to me, I do not understand but I fully support you. If this is going to make you to get education, then go for it. I said, Sibongile, now you have got yourself to being a leader. You're leading other girls. I needed to break the boundaries of my tradition. I chose to be a young woman of the community who can create her own identity. And I was scared, and I knew it was not right, but I had to do it because I think something bigger now in me lived. I believe that people, once they are conscientized, people can make choices. It is at the level of awareness that makes me to take action, and not just an easy action, but even the very, very difficult ones, and own that as my identity. Women's Leadership and Training Program does that with girls, create that for others. What I would really like for the girls is to understand that when they're protecting the environment, it's not about something that is abstract and out there. It's about protecting themselves and their identity and who they are. They must understand the climate science, and then of course the traditional things are important as well, so marry those kinds of knowledge. We've seen a lot of changing in the weather behaviors, but for us, how we read it is the time to plant, the availability of water. It tells us that things are not the same and are not going according to what we know. The calling of birds. There's a cuckoo that calls us to plant. And now this cuckoo, it comes in October. And that's not usual for us. This area has been taken over by timber, and we begin to wonder what would have life been if communities had all the grazing land. In the agroecology farming, the homestead can have life that promotes diversity. What we can do is to bring all the things that we need into our lives closer to home. The reason we created these gardens that have fruit trees and everything is not for us only, is to attract the biodiversity, the bees, the birds. When it comes to climate change, trees are carbon sinks. The girl cannot just plant because that says so much about ownership, but we've negotiated and navigate around those power issues. Working with girls for me is to build constituency of a younger voice that is different from mine. When I think of the future of the earth, it needs citizens like that. Citizens that are going to embrace life as a whole, as a gift to protect, to co-create something better. Although we are the group of women, I've seen some men coming and say, can we join the group? Now all the men are working in the field, not gender-based violence. No, I wouldn't say that. But when young men are conscientized, when you bring them into one space of working into a garden or testing the water, something changes in them in terms of relationship. For policies to be really meaningful, they must be solving what is a problem for a specific group or groups. For the girls here, they've never seen anyone testing water. Now they begin to say, but we are the ones who are affected. So it is very important for girls and women to be empowered, to be able to do that. Participation of girls and women is about telling your story, the way you experience it, not the way it's written. My name is Sibongile Mdungwa. My hope is on equity. I hope for justice. I hope for a better environment and indigenous knowledge to live, and spirituality is what runs in me.
Thank you very much, and thanks Sibongile and well, the whole Action 24 team for this beautiful video. It's really it speaks to a lot of themes that have been intersected with today's discussion, and I think there's no one better to unpack a little bit than Sibongile herself, who is present with us today. So I'd like to invite you, Sibongile, to take the floor and take us through some of the work that you've been doing and your own experience of, you know, addressing environmental degradation and climate injustices in the communities. So please, can we invite Sibongile to take the floor? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noel, and greetings, my sisters. Today, it's a very beautiful day for me because I've listened to the first speaker today, Miss N, and I think for the first time, I really feel that there is hope in the work that has to be done and in what we have been trying to achieve in our rural areas here in KwaZulu-Natal, and I'm sure in other areas as well, other women have been doing that. I think the lesson that I have learned in this work is that there is no way we can expect girls and women to be leaders if we don't invest on them at an early stage. That is why we start at the ages of 8 years going upwards. And it is also very true that girls have to believe that they are leaders at this age so that they can be free from patriarchy that has told them for generations, for centuries, that they cannot be leaders. So it is my pleasure for me today to hear that I'm not just here on my own in the small areas of KwaZulu-Natal, but I'm with other women and we are speaking the same language. We're putting all our effort together. And Ms. N also did mention that these voices have to be connected. And I think that is what has been missing in many situations, that our voices are isolated at a certain corner. But I believe that women have done all the work. And it is just now the time is now to connect these voices. Also, the voices of Indigenous women in this space, because if we can look at their wisdom and what I have experienced myself in that space of Indigenous communities, it's that their knowledge and wisdom is still not being taken care of, because the budget, if we can look at our budget, how much does our budget reflect the strength of Indigenous women? So that is also something that we need to think about going forward. And the biggest issue as well, especially knowing that our society is so patriarchal, is that land is such an asset, not just for production, not just for ownership only, but looking at the situation of gender-based violence. We are arguing in our project that when men and women, girls and boys, work on land, no one has used a hand hoe to hit the girl. We haven't seen a boy chopping the girl or a young woman in the field when they are working together. So we are arguing that working together on land is about building relationships that are life-giving, that are protecting girls. And it is because we've been removed systematically to appreciate and work on land. But as I say, going back to that could just be one therapy. And we have seen it working in our communities, although we cannot say it will work everywhere. But what if it will work, in other communities as well? And I am happy that today the issues of social justice, climate justice, and biodiversity are connected. That has been our biggest struggle in our work, because we felt that these issues are not, in silos and should not be addressed in that manner. However, what has defeated our own actions as civil society sometime, and as feminist movements as well, is because we want to separate things and to work in silos. So going forward, this is what we should try and make sure that our voices are connected across social, climate, gender, biodiversity, justice. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sibongile. I think, yeah, this was very powerful. I did note down a few points that I think speak directly to what we are addressing today. And it's very good to have it, told from the perspective of the lived experience you have, which many women and girls have, in fact. But I think it really drives the point home to hear it, and to hear it in your own words, which powerfully explain what are the issues, why they intersect, why we can't address one without the other. And I'm sure we will have the chance to discuss and unpack and maybe take some comments on what you just shared with us a bit later on. But thank you very much for providing that, shining that light on the discussion that we have, a bit less, academic and theoretical, that what we often hear. And that's what we wanted to bring into this discussion today, is different perspectives on that same issue. So thanks so much. I think I would like now to introduce our next session, which will be a bit more, I'm sorry for Amy, a bit more policy oriented, I would say. Before we moved to panel discussion, we wanted to have the chance to listen to an overview of that report I mentioned earlier when I opened the webinar, the report that was produced by the African Climate Reality Project, the South African Institute of International Affairs, and South Durban Community Environmental Alliance. It's a report that looks at gender mainstreaming into South African climate response. And for that, we have Amy Gilliam from the African Climate Reality Project, who will take us through some of the findings and recommendations so that this can fit into the discussion we would like to have afterwards. So Amy, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Noel. And it's certainly a tough act to follow Sibongile, but I'm really hoping that the report serves to reinforce many of the messages that Sibongile shared with us today. So I'm sharing my screen. I hope everyone can see it. But really, to start off, good morning, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to be with all of you today. As mentioned, I'm the branch manager of African Climate Reality Project. And over the next 15 minutes, I'll be providing an overview of the report that we produced with project partners, as Noel's mentioned, as part of an EU-funded project called Action 24, Active Citizens for Responsive Legislatures. And as you can see here, this is the title of the report, which I know has also been mentioned, so I won't go over that again. But really going into the research methods and objectives, the report is a combination of a global and national literature review, provincial and local policy analysis of Gauteng, Western Cape, Limpopo, and KwaZulu-Natal, and then interviews and focus group discussions with representatives of community-based organizations working in the gender and climate space. In terms of objectives, the reports aim to really evaluate three key areas. The first was to evaluate the extent to which South Africa's current legislative and policy framework on climate change incorporates gender considerations, really by drawing on case studies of countries with similar legislative commitments to gender equality. The second being to analyze the findings of primary research conducted via interviews and focus groups. And the third being to identify opportunities for enhancing the gender responsiveness of South Africa's response to climate change and propose recommendations for engagement and advocacy on these issues. As many of us have heard already, and I think all of us are aware, women, especially poor women, are one of the groups most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, but also least likely to have the responses and the resources to cope with them, which means that our policies have to be gender responsive and that policy development and decision-making processes need to be gender inclusive. So in this presentation, I will just focus on some of the key findings and recommendations of the report and encourage you to read it yourself. So moving into the global national literature review, there were three key findings. The first really was to highlight that South Africa is signatory to a number of regional and international treaties that committed to enhancing gender equality, addressing climate change, or both. The second being that the law and policy framework to respond to climate change at the national level is not gender inclusive. And this is despite the fact that South Africa has made a constitutional commitment to non-discrimination in Section 9 of the Constitution and to a clean and healthy environment in Section 24 of the Constitution. And then the third key finding is that gender is often put under the label of vulnerable groups, but this vulnerability is often not defined, indicating very little effort on part of policymakers to unpack the causes and impacts of this vulnerability or the impact of climate change on existing vulnerabilities. However, there are two exceptions. So these are the National Climate Change Response White Paper and the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy, which really commits South Africa to empowering local communities, including women, and to collaborating with women-led civil society formations and include gender sensitivity as a guiding principle. I don't have much time to go into detail, but I thought it's important to quickly pause at the national level and take a look at South Africa's revised NDC from a gender perspective, because there are some key points worth mentioning. The first is that while the NDC is considered stronger, the Climate Action Tracker still rates it as insufficient. The second point to mention is that ACRP collaborated with the South African Climate Action Network earlier this year to submit comments. And in our feedback on the revised NDC, we pointed out that the consideration of gender and vulnerable groups is missing. In fact, there was no reference to or even recognition of gender or how a gender responsive approach informed its development. We also highlighted that South Africa's law and policy framework to respond to climate change at the national level is not gender inclusive. So with that said, we suggested the following questions be considered in order to enhance gender mainstreaming into South Africa's NDC commitments. And as you can see here, many of the questions really centered around the use of resources among various gender groups, the ways that climate change affects different gender groups, the roles that they play, their capacity, as well as their participation in decision-making processes. Then looking at the provincial and local policy analysis, the first finding is really that the provincial policies analyzed are almost all gender blind. There's no evidence of data collection about the vulnerability to the impacts of climate change, nor of programs or plans to address gender differentiated resilience capacity or vulnerability. The second key finding being that there is no evidence that district municipalities are considering gender in their planning for climate disasters or response, or any emphasis on incorporating women into climate change decision-making forums where these do exist. And then really based on the 2 points above, it's unsurprising that municipalities did not report on climate change from a gender perspective in their annual reports. So in summary, the report shows that gender mainstreaming is not the norm in national, provincial, or local policy development, and that for the most part, policy is actually gender blind. And I think it's important to be clear that there's no such thing as gender neutral law and policy when it comes to climate change. There's only policy that is gender blind and will exacerbate existing inequalities. So this means that South Africa's law and policy framework has a significant gap in terms of its ability to plan, budget, and respond to climate change in a gender responsive way. So there's a common saying that a woman's work is never done, but it's also seldom paid for. And the interviews really highlighted this point by revealing a shared understanding among those interviewed that gender inequality and patriarchal social norms, when combined with climate change, increases the vulnerability of women to poverty, hunger, unemployment, and gender-based violence. In many instances, gender norms and the structure of families in South Africa make it more likely that female-headed households in rural areas are large, and that women are more likely than men to have childhood care responsibilities. Almost half of the stakeholders interviewed agreed that a man's job is to earn money and that a woman's job is to look after the home and family. And for most South African families, women are expected to perform the majority of household and childcare labor, regardless of whether they are employed or not. Climate change and natural disasters, as we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic, do make it more likely that children will need to stay at home and that women's family care responsibilities will increase. The focus group discussions also showed how these very same norms limit the ability of women to participate in policy-making discussions and decision-making around climate change adaptation and mitigation. So challenging patriarchal gender norms and family household roles is vital to ensure that women are more able to participate in climate change discussions, but also to improve community resilience to the impacts of climate change and to make sure that South Africa is able to respond to climate change in a gender equitable way. And then in a 2018 Afrobarometer survey, more than half of respondents said that they had just a little or no trust at all in the president and parliament. And the interviews conducted for the reports also revealed a similar lack of trust in public participation processes, elected officials, as well as disillusionment due to the poor responses for those who have been able to engage with policymakers. So really the disconnect between South Africa's law and policy framework and the experience of corruption, maladministration, and poor service delivery in many communities has contributed to a lack of trust in institutions. The state's failure to publicize policies and make them accessible for women and affected groups has reinforced this trust and reduced participation. So this means that creating a more gender-sensitive and effective climate change response will require addressing public trust in government. So moving into recommendations, we did identify recommendations for various stakeholders, and I will only focus on a few and highlight a few recommendations for each of them, but I do encourage you to read the rest in the report. So one of the recommendations is for the Women's Commission of the South African Local Government Association and the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs to hold a training for municipalities specifically on how to integrate gender responsiveness into their integrated development plans and their climate change response plans. We also suggested that they drive the development of multi-party women caucuses within municipalities. Then in terms of provincial governments, we recommended that they review their climate change plans through a process of public consultation that targets the involvement of gender-focused organizations and networks, and that includes input from the local level. On the other hand, in terms of provincial legislatures, we said they should establish a committee on climate change focused on the environmental, agricultural, economic, social, gender, and health impacts, and should ensure that the representation of this committee is diverse. We also said that they should hold public hearings on climate change and encourage and facilitate the participation of women and women's organizations. Then moving on to national government, we said that the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment should review the draft climate change bill for its gender responsiveness and amend it accordingly. We also said the department's plans should be reviewed for gender responsiveness as a matter of urgency. In terms of the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities, we recommended that you play an active role in Cabinet and in Cabinet working groups to ensure that policies, laws and strategies are gender responsive prior to being published for public comment and prior to being submitted to Parliament. And then in terms of national parliaments, we said that when the climate change bill is referred to Parliament, Parliament should promote gender analysis by referring the bill to all relevant committees, including the Portfolio Committee on Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities. And then moving into civil society groups, especially those at the local level, we recommended that they hold public meetings, and when they do so at a time that is convenient for women to attend, and where possible, childcare should be provided. We also said that CSOs can host multi-sectoral information sharing sessions on the topic of climate change to ensure that information is not limited to those already informed about climate change. And then finally, to incorporate a gender lens into public education programs where these exist. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. It was quite a lot of ground to cover, so I hope it all made sense. Thank you for your time and listening to the findings from our reports. You can access our website to get the reports, and if you have any further questions, please do reach out to me via email. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Amy. This was very informative and I think a very good highlight and summary of this report. It's an extensive report, as you said, it's about 80 pages. So, but I think it's very important research yeah, reporting on consultations that were held with various groups on this topic. It has many ramifications. There are many things to look at. So I think the report does a very good job, you know, to start unpacking those issues and making recommendations. It's a ever-changing field because policies evolve, and I mean, as we speak, the NDC, the draft climate change bill, I mean, those things are in motion, and I think it's important that those findings can feed into the thinking and the work that is ongoing at national level and Parliament, within DFFE, etc. And yeah, you also highlighted the very critical issue of participation, public participation, and I think this really linked directly to the topic of the webinar today. Beyond, you know, gender mainstreaming, we're looking at feminist action and women voices in addressing climate change and fighting for climate justice. And I think if a core issue we need to all address is participation and how various constituencies are part of the discussion and decision making. It's not just informing, but really consulting in a meaningful way. And as you know, it's an issue very dear to my heart. So I think I should not get started on it. But yeah, thank you very much for this. I think this is a good, and I just, yeah, you will find a link to that report in the chat. Nicole just posted it, if you're interested to read a bit further about it, from the departments, about what is happening, not just, you know, also the good story of what is being done, because it's not to say that we're starting from scratch, and yeah, we need to also acknowledge the efforts that that are being put by the departments to start being more gender responsive and inclusive in the policies and initiatives that are being, you know, put together. So I would like for that to invite first the representative from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, Funanani Muremi, to give us a bit of a information and highlight some of the efforts that she has been working on particularly, and yeah, what is the direction that the department is taking. Funanani, I will give you the floor, and then I will invite Tivolawi from the Department of Women on the same to also unpack. So this will be our last presentations for today before we move on to the panel discussion. Funanani, if you want to come on the floor, it's all yours. Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Funanani. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, colleagues. First of all, allow me to take this time to appreciate an opportunity to speak at this webinar, which I think is very important, considering that this is a topic that is coordinated by our department. My name is Funanani Muremi. I am from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. I am particularly responsible for international negotiation, focusing on adaptation, loss and damage, as well as gender issues. I would also like to recognize you, Noeline, and other fellow speakers that we have today, and all other participants. And I think I should also give special thanks to all the organizers that you mentioned in the beginning. Particularly, this is just the best way for me to end Women's Month celebration in South Africa. First of all, before I delve deeper in some of the initiatives and the policies that we have in the department, I think it's important, colleagues, to underscore that climate change is changing throughout the world at a very faster rate. And this has also been confirmed by the recent report, which has been released by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the fifth assessment report, which has confirmed yet again that even if we reduce emissions, we will be stuck with exacerbating impacts. And this means for us that as we now try to enhance climate action, we should even make sure it's even more relevant now to make sure that they are gender responsive. As many of you are aware that in our country, in South Africa, women make up 1% of the population, with a larger proportion living in conditions that are most vulnerable to extreme events and have no proper infrastructure, and these making them affected to climate change and its impact. It's also important to note that these existing gender differential effects of climate change are attributed to existing inequalities that we have between men and men in South Africa, such as unequal access to resources. I was listening closely to the previous speaker mentioning on how they are experiencing the impact of climate change in their day-to-day working. This also includes gender division of labor and division of power, which affects their ability to respond to the effects of climate change. And I think noting all those that I've said above, the department has a national climate change white policy paper that Amy mentioned in her report, that enshrines as one of its principles the realization of special needs and circumstances, and that these, in particular, women, those from rural area, have been singled out as being particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, given their traditional caregiving role. Colleagues, I think we should note that the department has been a strong promoter of inclusion of women forces in every aspect of sustainable development. And then in this regard, there was a decision taken during the 2013 and 14 financial year to develop a strategy towards a gender mainstreaming in the environment sector, and that is inclusive of climate change as a sector which cuts across. Such a strategy was the first in the country to provide a strategic guidance for gender mainstreaming in the environment sector, and the purpose was the purpose of the strategy was to argument and implement a framework for gender equality and women empowerment in the sector. Furthermore, I think this was also mentioned by Amy in one of her slides. The National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy, which was approved last in 2020, defines the country's vulnerability, plans to reduce those vulnerability and leverage opportunities, and outlines the required resources for such actions whilst demonstrating progress on climate change. It's important to note that this strategy has noted differentiated impacts of climate change between women and men. As a guiding principle, the strategy will promote participation of women, take gender differences in vulnerability to climate change into account, address the needs and priorities of both men and women. As a department, we have further committed to taking initiatives that continuously raise awareness on the issues of gender and climate change mainstreaming. I will mention a few. I think many of you are aware that as a department, we annually host Women in Environment Dialogue, which serves as a platform for women to share experiences. And this is a representative of all spheres of government, private sector, organized business, civil society, and representative of rural and urban environments, academia, research institution. And the last one took place in 2019, which focused on gender and climate change. We found that was very successful from our side. As well as through the National Green Fund, the department has supported projects led by women, inclusive of wastepreneur, treepreneur, energy efficiency, and reforestation, among others. And this project were able to generate about 1,000 of employment for vulnerable women living in poverty. We continue to conduct awareness raising and currently we're doing so through the Climate Change Gender Mainstreaming Workshop and the South African Capacity Building Initiative for Transparency. We held a workshop last year in August in 2020, and we're planning to have another one in September of 2021, which is next month, starting tomorrow. I think we're targeting mid-September. As the department has also established a environmental sector gender coordinators forum, and it was very interesting to listen to Ms. Anne when she was mentioning that these issues require a multi-stakeholder platform for them to be addressed, because these coordinators forum represent all spheres of government and serve as a platform to share experiences, support knowledge, and contribute and acknowledge the contribution of women in environmental management action. The purpose is therefore to ensure gender mainstreaming into planning, ensure policies accommodate gender mainstreaming and women issues, focus on empowering women in rural areas, raise literacy level of women involved in projects, ensure participation of women with disability, and to provide a platform to share the best practices in the environment sector on gender mainstreaming. I should also mention that in the department, we have also established a national climate change committee, which serves as a platform to consult government, civil society, and these include consulting women organization and youth organization, as well as business. This is to ensure that their contributions are captured in the climate change responses. And it is evident in what Amy was saying, that they were given an opportunity to submit even an input on the second national determined contribution that South Africa will be submitting before COP26 this year, their input on how we can ensure that national determined contribution is gender responsive. Looking ahead as a department, we have initiated a project through the support of our UNDP partner, which will ensure gender equality aspects are factored into the national determined contribution processes by leveraging analysis, strengthening institutional mechanism, and ensuring gender responsive climate action. This will include designing and implementing targeted training programs to build institutional and staff engagement capacity of relevant local, provincial, national sector department on climate change and gender mainstreaming. And I think this is one of the action area that I feel like it's related to the finding that we just presented now in the report. This initiative also intends to take a gender analysis of the national determined contribution key sector. You are all aware that these include those that are more vulnerable to climate change, such as your agriculture, energy, and so forth. This will identify gaps, barriers, and constraints for effective gender mainstreaming and develop measures to effectively advance gender equality and women empowerment in the national determined contribution implementation. We also intend to develop South Africa's first gender and climate change action plan. And now this plan aims to address existing gaps in policies, strategy, and will also contribute to a gender responsive national determined contribution implementation in South Africa. One last thing also that we intend on doing is to develop a gender and climate change budgeting and tracking system, which will guide resource allocation to ensure that women and men inclusively participate and benefit equitably from enhanced climate action. This include in the process to update the NDC in the upcoming cycle, as well as the implementation. I think from the discussion that we have had from the beginning, by the previous speakers, it is clear that women are part of the climate change solution, and women have the power to effective agents of changing in raising the game of climate action. This, as a Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, we will continue to ensure that climate change measures undertaken remain gender sensitive and they contain explicit provision to advance equity, equality in addressing climate change while contributing to climate resilience of our community. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Funanani. Yeah, I've learned a lot, and I'm very grateful that you were able to join us to share some of those very important information. I think part of what we are seeking to address here is also, bridging information gap. Like I said, policy and government programs are ever evolving things, and it's very good that we get a bit of a better understanding of what has been the work and the focus put on gender mainstreaming and ensuring that policies and frameworks are gender responsive and do not overlook the issue of gender equality and women's participation, and also what's in the works. You talked about several frameworks or plans or strategies that are in the making, and I think it would be very encouraging as a result of this webinar, some of the participants that are willing to engage on those documents or frameworks can and have the opportunity to engage the department, because I think those voices will really add value to how South Africa responds to climate change and promotes climate justice while mainstreaming gender. So yeah, thank you very much for shining some light on the work that is being done. And the fact that there's attention being paid from the government to the intersectionality between gender and climate. I think another perspective that we would like to hear is from the Department of Women, because their mandate is to ensure that women's rights and gender equality is mainstream across all areas of government, and I'm very pleased that we have with us Tivu from the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disability. Thank you very much for making the time to join us. If you would like to maybe share with us how gender is being mainstreamed from your department into the work of other departments, especially with regard to climate change response. Thank you very much.
Program Director, Noel Dashin, UN Representative, Ms. N. Shongwe, Gituku Shongwe, and then fellow panelists and participants, good morning. It is indeed a pleasure for me to be part of this important event today, which looks at the issues of the mainstreaming climate change in gender into climate change responses in South Africa. And then indeed, let me start by echoing the sentiments that climate change affects women, men, boys and girls in different ways. And then they are entrenched and systemic discrimination that lead to gender differentiated impacts of climate change with respect to health, food security, livelihoods, and human mobility, amongst others. And then there are also intersectional forms of discrimination that makes women and girls more vulnerable to issues of climate change. And then one other important issue is the fact that, if we exclude women and girls from climate action, it makes it less effective, or whatever actions that we come with, they will be less effective, and then they will further exacerbate the climate harms. As the Department of Women, Youth, and Persons with Disability, we know that despite the fact that gender equality is entrenched in our Constitution, women and men do not enjoy equal rights and benefits and protection. And then the mandate of our department is to regulate the socio-economic transformation and implementation of empowerment and participation of women, youth, and persons with disabilities. And then the department is the custodian and the steward of gender policy in South Africa. And our primary role is to ensure that gender priorities, including those arising from national and international commitments, are mainstreamed across the state machineries towards achieving gender equality and better development and outcomes for women and girls. And then the issue of mainstreaming is very, very important for us. Hence, we're saying that we are the custodian and the steward of gender policy in South Africa. And then it is important for us, when we look at the existing policy framework and initiative, to note that important gender equality and women's empowerment policies and systems that we have, that should be assisting us, in mainstreaming gender into climate changes, responses, and into climate change actions, are outdated. And then, the existing also policy framework lacks the implementation and monitoring of those implementation. The first policy framework that I will want to highlight is the National Policy Framework on Women's Empowerment and Gender Equality, which was adopted and approved by Cabinet in 2000. The policy framework established a clear vision and framework for gender mainstreaming across laws, policies, procedures, and practices, which serves to ensure equal rights and opportunities for women and men in all spheres and structures. And then, the report on the gender lenses on mainstreaming gender into South African climate change responses indicate that most of the policies that we have and the legislations are gender blind. And then that's why we're saying that we acknowledge that there is lack of implementation of this national policy framework. And then, this policy framework also acknowledges that large proportion of women in rural areas are dependent on natural resources and are affected by poverty, and access to these resources is also a gender issue. And when we talk about dependent on natural resources and we link it with issues of climate change, then that's where we will say that, the impact of climate change, it's more severe when it comes to women. And then women struggle to get water, wood, fuel, as well as access to many other resources. Then as the department, what we are doing in order to ensure that the national policy framework on women's empowerment and gender equality is relevant and then it's implemented is that we have from this year taken it upon ourselves to review this policy, and then we will be taking it through all the proper processes in order to ensure that we have a new updated policy which addresses the current realities and then looks at issues such as mainstreaming in the different sectors. And then the issue of environment and climate will be one of those areas that will be addressed through this policy framework. And then the next policy framework is a legislation that we had, which is the Women's Empowerment and Gender Equality Bill. I think most of the participants knew that the department had introduced this bill sometime back in 2012, 2013. However, the bill was withdrawn. So as the department, we are in the process of reintroducing the wage bill, which is now close to going into the cabinet processes, and it will soon be published for comments. And then, this bill we are reintroducing it to give effect to Section 9 of our Constitution, in as far as empowerment and gender equality is concerned, and also the establishment of a framework for empowerment and of women, amongst others. And then it also focuses on the issues of socio-economic empowerment of women, not just treating or talking about the empowerment of women in general, but we need also to acknowledge that women are not homogeneous. We have women that live, in urban areas, in rural areas, in informal settlement. We need to ensure that, we facilitate sustainable livelihoods and decent work that talks to women that are in different areas. And then we also, the wage bill will also focus on issues of mainstreaming gender into land reform programs to ensure that land is in the hands of women in rural areas, together with skills and financial resources. Because if we say that women are dependent on nature or on agricultural resources, then they also need to have access to land. And when we talk about issues of climate change, and then we say it's affecting women in such a way that if they don't have access and control over the land that they are working on, it also exacerbates their challenges or the problems that they have. And then as the Department of Women, the third existing policy framework that we have is the gender responsive planning, budgeting, monitoring, and auditing framework that have been approved by Cabinet. It was introduced in 2018 and approved by government in 2019. This gender responsive budgeting framework has been acknowledged in the report on gendered lens for mainstreaming gender into South Africa's climate change response. And then it aims to ensure a more sustainable, comprehensive, and multi-sectoral approach to gender mainstreaming within the country's planning, monitoring, and evaluation, as well as public financing system. And then it focuses on closing the gap between plans throughout through an overall approach to mainstreaming through planning, budgeting, monitoring, and evaluation. And then this gender responsive planning, monitoring, and evaluation is supplemented by the country gender indicator framework, which also the report has identified as being introduced to say that they are not yet sure as to how far it is. And then we are happy to announce that the country gender indicator framework, it's undergoing the cabinet process. It's we are submitting it for approval to cabinet. And then, it will strengthen our ability to plan and measure progress towards gender equality and women's empowerment. So the inclusion of gender indicators and targets in the planning instruments and budget, will be key and essential in laying the basis for development of gender responsive implementation. Therefore, it means that the actions and also targets for climate change, more especially when it comes to gender issues, they will be, indicated, or they will be part of the indicators and targets that are included in our gender indicator framework as it draws from the national, the regional, the continental, and the international instruments. So those targets were drawn from all those instruments, and then they also have specific targets that looks at issues of mainstreaming issues of gender into climate change responses. And then as the department, we are also developing an overarching gender mainstreaming strategy, because the issue of mainstreaming gender into climate change and mainstreaming gender into all other government initiatives, it's a challenge. We have realized that, when it comes to most of the policies that are being developed, departments and many role players are struggling with the issues of how to gender mainstream most of the issues that they have. Although we do have a requirement through the socio-economic impact assessment requirement by the Department of Public DPME, we know that which requires each and every department to indicate the implication and benefits of each and every legislation and policy for women, youth, and persons with disabilities and all the other vulnerable groups. Individual departments are still struggling to ensure that they do respond positively, and they are also struggling to come up with interventions and mechanisms that looks at the issues of mainstreaming of women, youth, and persons with disabilities. And then we are also looking at the issues of addressing women's unequal economic and social position through the access to government and private sector procurement, issues of employment, land, and financial resources. Because when we talk about the climate change responses, it shouldn't be more about trying to mitigate the impact of climate change responses, but it should also focus on the economic benefits that women and girls could draw from the actions or from the climate change responses action. So there should be economic benefits. If there are any initiatives and measures that are taken, how do we ensure that women are benefiting from such from procurement of such issues? And then, we are also glad to or happy to indicate that, the National Treasury, in terms of promoting the empowerment of women, they are also in the process of, introducing the different reforms in supporting the economic empowerment of women, in creating an enabling environment for for climate change issues. And then this is done to ensure that women secure opportunities in the development of climate change responses and the green economy. Yesterday we had the Department of the National Treasury when we were launching the economic empowerment of women in the green industries in the West sector report, wherein they were indicating the importance of using the preferential procurement to promote women's economic empowerment. And then, this will also be done through the new procurement bill, which will set aside the procurement targets for women and youth-owned enterprises. Because when we talk about the responses, there will also be, procurement opportunities for women. But we need to ensure that they are set aside targets for women and youth. And as the department, using the gender responsive budgeting, planning, and monitoring framework, we will be monitoring how we are doing in as far as meeting the set targets. As we have already heard, the president has announced that the issue of 40% set aside targets for women-owned enterprises. So those are the issues that we will be also looking at when it comes to issues of responses on climate change. So ensuring the implementation of the gender responsive budgeting to address the challenges of mainstreaming, that's what the department will be doing. And then, I think, those are the initiatives that the Department of Women, Youth, and Persons with Disabilities, have initiated in response to issues of mainstreaming gender into all the policies and initiatives by government. Program Director, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Tivulawi. This was a very useful insight in the work that the department is doing in mainstreaming gender across those various sectors and fields and the various tools that are already available. And like you said, some of them either need to be updated, taking into account the gaps and shortcomings that have been identified over time, and others are, we're dealing with the issue of implementation, and it's not necessarily to say there's lack of will, but also implementation is not necessarily an easy thing. So the how is indeed a very big question, and as you've unpacked very effectively, there are so many aspects to be taken into account when you want to mainstream into planning, budgeting. It's not a simple thing. You have to take many things in consideration at the same time, and the articulation of it is quite challenging. So yeah, I think it was useful also to get that perspective, to emphasize that it might look easy on paper, but then implementation comes with its own challenges. And also when we are dealing with multiple levels of government that are coordinated, but each with their sphere of competence. And yeah, we understand the, the magnitude of the task. But it is reassuring and encouraging to hear that there's a lot of work being done and new frameworks being developed. I think what matters is that when it comes to implementing them or refining them, tweaking them based on experience, you bring on board those who have a lived experience of it, so that they can provide insights and suggestions as to how to strengthen those tools and frameworks. You talked also about cross-sector interventions, and I think those are very important in addressing the intersectionality of gender and climate justice. So thank you very much for taking the time to unpack this. We are running a bit behind schedule, so I think we will swiftly move on to the panel discussion, which will be moderated by Nicole. We will maybe shorten it a little bit so that we can catch up on the schedule. So we will have about 40 minutes to discuss based on what has been presented so far, and also get some reflections from our panelists. Nicole, I will give the floor to you and to our panelists. We will have 4 panelists. We have Sibongile Mutungwa, who talked earlier, as well as Bertha Chiroro from Gender CC, Gabriel Klassen from African Climate Alliance, and Tivu Lawi, who just presented on the work of the department. So Nicole, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Noel, and thanks also for introducing the panelists. Please can I ask that you turn your cameras on during the panel discussion. There's a few questions we'd like to cover, and I'll direct some to each of you directly. If you'd like to respond to a panelist's answer, please just use the raise hand function and I will call on you straight afterwards. And I think just being mindful of time, please be mindful when you are answering to give everyone an equal opportunity to contribute. So the first question I have is, I think I'll start off with Bertha because we haven't heard from you yet today. How do elements of the report mainstreaming gender into South Africa's climate change response resonate with your experience and work in the field of gender and climate?
The report actually touches on a lot of the things that we see on the ground. And it really shows us that climate change is not gender neutral. And climate change impacts are widespread in most of the communities that we're working with. And we see women being disproportionately carrying the burden because they are mostly the poor and most vulnerable within the communities, be they rural and urban. And they constitute the majority of the world's poor. That is very much known. And in South Africa, large proportions of the population live in impoverished circumstances where informal settlements are set up in locations that are vulnerable to extreme weather events, and they don't have proper housing infrastructure, and they suffer the harsh conditions against rain, wind, and cold, and also food insecurity. And the report actually touches on those issues quite significantly. And also the fact that whilst policies are there, I didn't want to rush today. Whilst policies are there, the implementation of those policies is not being seen at all on the ground by the communities that are on the ground.
Thank you, Bertha. And I think what you've said definitely cuts across how climate justice is social justice in these communities when it relates to gender equity. I think, Gabriel, if we could hand it over to you to touch on some elements of how the report resonates with your work at African Climate Alliance.
Definitely. I hope you can hear me correctly. But so basically, when I was going through the report and I had the pleasure of having some time to really go into depth with it, a lot of what Bertha was saying right now really resonated to me as well. But in a youth perspective, as African Climate Alliance is a youth-led organization and movement, what I really noticed was the points about unemployment. South Africa is known at its current moment to be plus or minus 74 point something % youth unemployment. And within there, you can only imagine the disparity of, or the disproportion of women and men, and of course within there, non-binary peoples. But actual disparity when it comes to gender, when it comes to unemployment, and this obviously tying into when we decide as a coalition, as civil society, how we move forward to green jobs, to a green economy, to a just future, because of this notion of this gender neutrality, which is completely ignorant to think of. We would go in blind. It's as to say, I don't see race. It's not taking into account the disparity that we're already experiencing. Another way that I really see it is through the focusing and the centering of women and girls in the climate justice movement. Oftentimes we see that women and girls are pushed to the side or are not prioritized in the movement, when in fact they should not only be leading the movement, but at the heart of the movement, because they are the most affected in the space. And I say women and girls because oftentimes we talk about women as if, that's capturing girls as well, but we have to understand that there is an age demographic indifference, as mentioned earlier, and we saw in that video, the way that things are perceived and acted on in society. I think the way that I see it is that it's time for us to really look at when we unpacking things, and what really spoke to me in that kind of piece in the blog and the article was that it's time for us to look beyond this idea that things can be viewed in silos and isolation. Gender justice is climate justice, is social justice, is economic justice. And at the end of the day, we need system change. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabriel. And I think, the notion of gender neutrality, it goes back to, I think, also what the report says about approaching it from a gender blind perspective will only exacerbate the existing inequalities that are currently experienced on the ground. Sibongile, I know that you've shared some of your story already with us today, and I think something that you say in the video around how the policies that are put together need to address an issue for a specific group of people. And I wonder if you could share a bit more about how the topics of the report relate back to your experience with the Women's Leadership and Training Program, and your work on the ground with women and girls.
Thank you very much, Nicole. The issue of leadership, I think it comes across strongly in the report as well, in one way or the other, and other presenters as well have touched a lot on that. That's one of the crises we have in South Africa, that leadership that is decisive and leadership that is grounded at an early stage to understand and to feel and to grasp what leadership is, in a positive manner. That is what is lacking. And that is why it's important today to make sure that leadership doesn't just find itself in the middle of the drowning boat or drowning something, but leadership is nurtured at an early stage. But also what the report is showing is that, and what I would like to put forward is that it has to be, the narrative has to change. Women are not, yes, the label is that they are poor, and yes, they are. They've got no voice, and I agree. However, it is up to us as community development practitioners to raise women and girls in a way that the language changes, because girls and women are the defenders of life. So you cannot say to me that the defender of life is poor. No, the defender of life is powerful. And until we see girls and women in that manner, then we will be then moving towards a direction that is giving women and girls the voice and the power that they have. For ages, they carry this burden of being poor. I don't consider myself as poor. I don't consider every single girl and woman as poor. I see the defender of life. And therefore, those people, for me, we must stop labeling people and believing the negative about people, especially the people that we think we are serving. No, we must show the highest belief about them. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Sibongile. And I think that really resonates with myself, and I'm sure very many in the audience as well, around changing that narrative that women and girls are powerful defenders of life. Tivo, I wonder if there is anything you would like to add on. I know that you have already touched on the report itself, but if there's any response you have regarding what the other panelists have had to say so far.
Thanks, Noel, Nicole. For me, the report resonates well with us, and then, it touched important issues when it comes to, the policy, the gender responsiveness of policies that we as government has, to say that, there is indeed a big challenge when it comes to issues of, gender responsiveness of policies, and then that is the issue that I think, we need to put more emphasis on, to say that the issues of mainstreaming or gender implementation of gender responsive budgeting, planning and monitoring and evaluation is key when it comes to issues introducing the policies. But one other thing that, I thought, or an opportunity that I thought the report should have also capitalized on, is the issue of, the economic benefits, of women and girls, from the climate change actions that we take. Because, for me, that is key. We shouldn't look at the issues of climate change to say that we are protecting people from the harm of climate change, but we also need to say, as and when we respond to issues or to mitigate the climate change, we need to ensure that the economic benefits of this goes to women. How much are women benefiting from those? What opportunities exist for women when it comes to the climate change action responses? Because those are the key issues that we might want to look at. And there are key institutions that we might also, or that we should have maybe included in as part of our recommendations in the report, like, the National Treasury, the Department of Small Business Development, and then the Department of Trade, Industry and Cooperation. Those are key departments when it comes to issues of access to finance and resources by women. So how do we ensure that those departments also do support women-owned enterprises when it comes to delivering on the responses on climate change actions? Those will be my input for now. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think that also goes back to what you mentioned earlier regarding the challenge of not just mainstreaming gender into climate change policy, but across the board in government departments and committees. Then moving on, my next question would be what, I think we'll start with Gabriel this time. What would your key recommendations be for policymakers on making our response to climate change more gender inclusive?
Thank you for that, Nicole. I think I just want to touch on first what Smongila said was, stop looking at women as poor. But in that same narrative, we all know the phrase, you strike a woman, you strike a rock. But in that same phrase, understand that that we should not take that phrase to mean that because women can take the pain and take the strike, that we should let them keep taking the strike in the blunt. There should not always have to be a thing of, yes, she's a powerful woman, she's a strong woman, she can endure. It should be a thing of, she is, but why is it that she has to be? And I think that's something that we don't tackle. And we often look to women and say, cool, what is the change you want to see? And I think that's important, but we also need to look at men and perpetrators of things and say, what is the change you're going to do? We never look the other side of the panel. And then to your point about what policymakers and decision makers could do and should do, I think what we don't see enough of is this intersectionality and true intersectionality and inclusion. There is the idea that after I've written a policy and I've decided what I'm doing with what I'm doing and how I'm doing, then I'm going to take it to women and say, cool, what are your 5 cents that I can add at the bottom in an addendum? Or maybe I can say, check out this YouTube link to a video that we spoke about. When in fact, it should be from the beginning of the initial planning stage, when the brainstorm is on the page, that is when women should be involved, and not just women who are white, women of color, Black women predominantly, and women with disability. I think oftentimes we overlook the intersections of identity factors that make up women in this country. And then going further than that, looking at the intergenerational approach as well, because we need the current generation, but we also need the ideas of the future generation involved and incorporated into decision-making. And so to make policy more gender inclusive, I think it's not about what can we do now, but rather what should we have been doing, where have our flaws been, and how are we going to change and transform this? Because we can't have it be a thing of, okay, cool, we're bringing in 2 new strategists and they're all women, and they will be campaign volunteer journalists. But then the person who's sitting at the end of the day, who's going to look at the final edit of the policy, is a man who has been sitting there for 20 years and hasn't been bringing forth change. And while I'm not saying that you necessarily have to be a woman to have a feminist approach, because I believe that we can all be feminists, I think it's integral when it comes to gender justice for women to be at the forefront and deeply included and like intersectional within the space. I think without it, we are not viewing things in the way that we should, and we are not heading to a future that, there was a mention that in 10 years, we would reach a future that is, built with equality, but I think it should be of equity. And without that, that kind of incorporation, we aren't heading there at all anytime soon.
Thank you, Gabriel. Bertha, I see you nodding along very enthusiastically. Would you like to add on to Gabriel's point?
Yes, what Gabriel actually said really touched me, because in terms of policies, we find that South Africa does have some of the most beautiful policies, and most of those policies, what ends up happening on the ground is they come to us and they said, please check if gender is properly integrated in these policies. And we find that that is very, very problematic. It should be from the onset that women participate from the beginning in these policies. And it's really something that worries me all the time. We see an NDC, we see lots of our policies, beautiful policies. The reason why they are not being implemented because there is no ownership to those people of we should direct those policies towards. So they are not part and parcel of the decision making, of deciding on those policies. And that should actually happen from the beginning. Let them put their inputs. And also these policies, when they come to the communities, for example, as we work with grassroots communities, let them be simplified in such a manner that they understand how these policies will impact them. The issue of language is very important. Give it to them in the language that they do understand. And most of the time, we use languages that most of our communities do not actually understand. Education, raising awareness and sensitization should be in the language of those communities that they understand. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bertha. I think off the back of that, looking at meaningful participation and intersectionality, Sibongile, what are your thoughts on how we can translate that intersectionality between gender equality or equity and climate justice agendas on the ground?
I think one very important aspect, I have mentioned it before, but I will repeat, the issue of indigenous knowledge. I think it's very important in this space. As it also has been said in the video, take the people to what they know and what they've been. We've got stores of knowledge packed, for a long, long time, that in a way that we even forgetting, that knowledge, that it exists, and forgetting how useful it is. And sometimes until a very clever so-and-so brings it back to us and we think it's something new. And we know it's not new. And that is the whole thing of decoloniality, how to decolonize our minds to understand that we have it all. If it was taken, or if we were made to believe it's not working, we must just know that deeper, there is something that we call our wealth. There is something that we call life-giving values that have sustained, communities, relationships, the climate, how people interact with the land, with the soil. And we have got rituals, we've got celebrations that tells us so. And those all those things together, they are alive, but until we see them in that manner. And I think going forward, we must not overlook the part about indigenous knowledge. And of course, combining it with the contemporary science, what the climate science is telling us right now, it's so much relevant, and we need to understand that. We must understand that in order to build a strategy at any level that will make us to solve the issues in a sustainable and long life strategy, rather than the short-term strategies that only solve the today only. So I think those are the two that we need to, we need to put many things together, but I will highlight the indigenous knowledge, the science today, to say they both live, and there's none that has to be undermined. Thank you.
Thank you, Sibongile. I think definitely agree. It's so crucial that we do ground our climate plans and innovations within nature and within those indigenous knowledge sources. I think, Tibulawi, I would like to also pose the same question from your perspective on how can we translate that intersectionality between gender equality and climate justice agendas on the ground? Apologies, you are on mute.
Thank you. I think, the issues that Sibongile has raised, it's profound and it's very important. The issue of using women's unique knowledge and experience, more especially at local level, because there are times that, we do ignore the experiences of, women on the ground, and then we don't include them to give us those solutions that will, as women
I'm not sure if it's just breaking up on my side.
We also need to look at the issues, of, disability. We also need to look at the issues of, the age, because those are the key issues that also plays, a role in the whole aspect of intersectionality that puts women, at more risk when it comes to issues of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we lost you a little bit in the middle there, but I think your point goes back to the importance of fostering meaningful and inclusive public participation and policy development processes. And that's something that both government and civil society can work together on in fostering that participation from the ground up. Bertha, moving on, in your opinion, what are some of the key issues or leverage points around climate justice that feminist movements and actors should or could focus on, for example, energy or leadership and voices, or whatever comes to mind from your perspective?
The feminists really needs to focus on issues of ensuring that there's inclusion. And in terms of social justice, from what Sibongile was talking about, she touched on lots of issues such as just water availability itself. We had the COVID pandemic, and most of the people were being asked to wash their hands, and yet many of the communities that we work with, they've actually been living on day zero since they were born. I'll give an example of one day we arrived at one of the schools in Limpopo in Guyana, and we find that because of issues of gender equality and not mainstreaming and not bringing men and women and everybody else to understand what are the needs of men and women, we find that the boys were busy playing football. The girls had walked 5 kilometers away to look for water, and that water was supposed to be given to everybody else. So these are some of the issues we need to be able to look at. Water availability is a right, and it should be provided for by the municipalities, by the local governments. We don't have to witness day zero from the day that most people are actually born. And there's also another thing that we need to really look at. We need to ensure that by involving the men and women from the local communities and groups and the cooperatives, they know exactly what they want in terms of how they can change their lives, the women themselves, the indigenous knowledge, and ensuring that we promote a shift away from this kind of food system which excludes them. We need a much more decentralized food system, which includes which promotes localized and indigenous crop-based food systems and agroecology. That is very, very important. Traditional crops, for example, seed sharing, heritage variety, this helps to deliver resilience to climate change and food sovereignty for smallholders and women. Such practices, I believe, would allow for multiple benefits, including increased agricultural diversity, promoting ecological diversity with indigenous varieties, and improved resilience of communities. I've gone in areas that I work with. What we find is that there's a lot of these methods being fused together. The science is there, it's quite understood, but all the indigenous methods of food preservation that most people were using before, such as drying and canning and things like that, that they had learned from their grandparents or whatever, those are the things that managed to take communities and make them survive even during the COVID pandemic. We also need to ensure that we avoid these additional responsibilities for women and increase on their workload by making sure that clean and affordable and accessible public transport is available. We see women with children on their backs struggling to go and work to do something in order to earn a living. And disaster reduction plans, can they all be make sure that they are inclusive of gender? The early warning systems that we talk about, can we share that information so that at least it goes to most of the communities themselves? And from what Sibongile was talking about, when there is a disaster, when there is actually a lot of these things, we find that vulnerability we're talking about, we are not talking about just because women are weak, but we find that sometimes women and girls are raped whilst they're busy looking for water, which is a very, very important commodity. So this is quite important. And the restoration of soils for climate sensitive agriculture, that is very, very important. Improving access of women to healthcare services. This is quite critical because right now, look at the COVID crisis. We have to think about women's wellness and everything else as part of a holistic approach to mainstreaming issues of gender and climate change and happiness in order to build a sustainable society, support green ecological initiatives. And we've heard about issues of leadership there. There are so many small to medium enterprises that are out there, and what they need, whether they are in recycling, whether they are small agribusinesses, whether they are in honey making, beekeeping, what they need is a little bit of just support to support them to be able to have the business skills that they require in order to make them sustainable, especially at this time where issues of food security are actually quite important. I'll stop there and then add on to the other thing. And one more thing, which is very particular, which is what we are passionate about, is about decentralized renewable energy systems, the use of renewable energies. Let's invest in that. Why are we not investing in solar panels, in biogas digesters? We find that communities that have renewable energy, whether be it in Limpopo and whatever, they've managed actually to set up climate smart businesses that are sustainable. And for us, that is very important. That is the way we can raise communities from where they are to be able to provide them with the lighting that they need, the food that they need, and having access to affordable energy is critical. Energy efficient street lights to prevent issues of where women and girls, they are targeted, sometimes they are raped, and their safety is not guaranteed. And those are the things that we would want to see on the ground. And I think I will also stop there, but mostly efficient irrigation technologies should be supported, including the indigenous methods the ones that have been using over the years, safe energy and organic agriculture. Those are the things that the methods that most communities that we work with have been using, and that knowledge has been passed from generation to generation, and we should be able to use that in order for us to have sustainable communities and ensure that they're sustainable livelihoods. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bertha. Some very key points there. I think so important is that involvement from the very beginning of the local women and men in these decision-making processes. I think that's so important for community buy-in, which can ensure the sustainability of those interventions while also giving the community ownership over those solutions. We are running very short on time, so I'd like to go to the next question. I'd like for everyone to briefly give their answer. If we can just focus on one aspect of this next question, please. We can start off with Tibulawi. What are your thoughts on how government, civil society, and private sector stakeholders can work together to mobilize South African feminist movements for climate justice? And if there is time, how can we use that to increase gender sensitivity of our policies, practices, and climate ambitions?
Thank you, Program Director. You know, for me, how government and civil society, you know, and private sector can work together, it's, you know, we need also to have, you know, the tools for the implementation of, you know, gender justice actions in order to influence, you know, issues on climate change. And then we also need to ensure that, you know, we do, you know, advocacy programs, capacity building, and also, you know, some technical support, you know, to create networks and partnership for the gender justice actions. And that's what I could say we need to do, you know, issues of creating networks and partnerships, which will enable us to, you know, work together rather than, you know, to compete against each other. Because if we work together, I think we can get more out of the actions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your brief answer. I'd like to pass it over to Gabriel.
Thank you. I think a lot has been said today, and I've been drawing on it, and I'll definitely take it forward. And the reason I say I'll definitely take it forward is because I think areas of collaboration and centers that need to be moved forward should be, at least in my opinion, now we need to realize that a pivotal way that we can find those intersections and bridge those gaps is through collaboration, but also through, you know, with that collaboration, one of the facets being the education of young girls, not only just in general, but in addition to that, specific education in climate and environmental arena and space. I think oftentimes we overlook the greatness that can come from when you capacitate young people, when you capacitate women. I don't like to say empower, because people like to say, I'm empowering a woman. It's like, she's empowered. She just doesn't have the resources or necessarily the capacity to do it because of social reproduction, having to be at home, having to do things that have been culturally and historically set aside in these gender roles that we put out in communities and society. And so I think in this kind of collaborative effort moving forward with civil society, government, individuals on this panel, and just, you know, your regular person on walking on the road, I think we need to highlight that every moment is a teaching moment. That I think that there needs to be a clear a gender justice focus in education as well, not just so that, you know, girls can be aware of things, but so that boys and non-binary persons and gender fluid persons can be aware of their impact and their role in the space, and importance in the space. But then, of course, as I mentioned as well, the prioritization of education of young girls and women in communities. I think those are the areas that I predominantly think is a need. And in that education, I think earlier someone mentioned in the language of the persons in that community. I think we often do this thing where, and I think government is extremely responsible. And so I do apologize if anyone takes offense, but at the same time, I don't. There is a idea of come to our consultation. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't speak that language. Oh, good luck next time. You can look at the notes next time. It's like, no, we have got 11 official languages, 12 if you count South African Sign Language. I do. And yet everything is taught in English. Everything is done in Afrikaans, you know, and then just add some spice. I say, you know, like then they add like, you know, just on the top layer. But we need an incorporative educational dialogue. And then if you do it in English, make it understandable, break down the concepts, lose this jargon that benefits no one at the end of the day, because, you know, you can ask someone who has been using the jargon for years, what does that actually mean? And they've become so used to using the jargon that they've lost roots to its actual meaning as well. So that is in my essence and where I stand with that question. I hope it made sense.
Thank you, Gabriel. I think that goes back to the importance of true diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice when it comes to these issues. Sibongile, I'd like to pass on to you for your last thoughts in this section.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, Betha, and Mukwevo. I think you've said it all. I will just add on that the issue of language, you know, of how do we're so grateful to have these good policies. And we have learned, or we are learning, that it's not, it's the job of government to do so, but it is our job to make it real. So we're just learning that the hard way at times. But also the issue of language, as Gabriel is taking it, you know, 11, 12 languages. And in many cases, we had to go beyond the 11, 12. Like at the moment, I am at work, we are publishing a book that is written in the language of from the southern part of KZN to the eastern parts of the Eastern Cape, which is the Bata language. And so it means from Zulu, Xhosa, and English, which are the official languages of the area, we have to take our message to this language from the breast of our mothers, you know, and make it real in that manner that when people remember things, we don't remember things in English and Zulu. Even myself, I'm considered as Zulu, but I don't remember things mostly in Zulu or in English. I remember things in Bata. And therefore, if that is the case, then it means the memory of that language has to live again and has to be spoken and has to be written, because it has never been written. So it has to be written before it dies completely. So it means partnership is going to happen at all those levels that are in the framework of our constitution, but even beyond that framework, because even that framework is not complete, because it still excludes the minorities. It still excludes, not intentionally, you know, because it's because we need to at least limit to a certain number. So I think that is a key thing. Another key thing, one of the things that I feel so bad about in my work in development, it's when I thought and assumed that young people are not interested in climate change, or are not interested in biodiversity work, and they want, you know, so-called city life, or they just don't want to be in the rural areas. That was my biggest mistakes of my work at an early stage, because young people have proved otherwise. When we went to the people, when we went to them as young people and recognized their power, their leadership, and helping them to understand that their leadership is valid. They showed me flames. They showed me that they can lead better than me. They see the future better than me. And therefore, many times they tell me, Sibongile, sit down. We see far. You see the present and the past. So I'm able to sit down today because I've learned that I'm not the guru here. They are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sibongile. And lastly, just mindful of time, Bertha, your brief thoughts on how government, civil society, and private sector stakeholders can work together on advancing feminist action for climate justice.
I'll just add on to what Sibongile has said, to say, bring everyone on board. You know, firstly, she was even talking about the youth. And most of the times we think we know it better. And yet there is a lot of innovative ideas out there. Who is going to harness those innovative ideas and make them into policies and to change people's lives, especially at this time when things are so difficult? So partnerships are quite critical, and those partnerships should ensure that we do not leave anyone behind. There is no point in leaving anyone behind in those partnerships. And government should not become those closed doors that way people can knock in and come in and be accessible in terms of issues of policies. So partnership, education, and raising awareness, collaboration is very, very important, because nobody is an island and we can do this together. We've seen it all the time, that where there is a will, there is a way. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists today. I've seen a lot of comments coming through in the chat function. I think a lot of what has been said has resonated with everyone. But thank you again. And with that, I will pass back over to Noel.
Thank you, Nicole, and thanks to all our panelists. I think there was a lot of food for thought, but also a very important lesson that was given, you know, that sometimes we also need to refrain from trying to reinvent what exists. And I think the notion of partnerships and networking is also there to support, you know, sharing the information and what people have learned and experienced, and the knowledge they can bring to the table. Because unfortunately, it's also a bit of a race against time when we look at climate change, but also gender inequalities. So we need to learn from indigenous knowledge, like Sibongile stressed it, but also from, you know, what various stakeholders have been doing, so that we can move faster and more efficiently to integrate gender equity or equality into our climate justice work. So thank you very much for sharing that. I would like now to open to the discussion and maybe sharing some of the comments that have been coming through on the chat. I will read out some. I think everyone has access to the chat, so I'm not necessarily going to take all the comments. If there were questions that were unanswered, I will also raise them. We've got about 15 minutes. So I'd like to invite those who haven't had the chance maybe to raise their question to raise their hand if they would like to pose a question or make a comment, and then we will give them the floor. Yes, so some of the questions that have been coming through, or comments, I think there was one earlier on the report that Amy presented, which was asking whether the gender blindness was relating to climate change policy or policy in general. I think I got the answer to that. I think the report specifically looks at climate-related policies, so the analysis was focusing on that. I don't think we can presume of how policies in general are including and mainstreaming gender. This is a much broader field of research. So yeah, the report was focusing on climate change policies and finding that they were not gender inclusive enough, and that gender neutrality is in fact a misleading notion when it comes to policies. And then Funanani did speak to the work that is being done to address that. There was also an interesting comment, and maybe we can invite Shamila to share a bit of her experience, saying that the Western Cape government has an active gender mainstreaming forum. And this was in response to some of the recommendation to foster multi-party caucuses at various levels. So I think it could be either in this platform or further in discussions. It will be interesting to learn from the experience that exists in the Western Cape and maybe in other areas, provinces or municipalities, in terms of gender mainstreaming far, so that we can learn from that. So I don't know if Shamila, you want to add a bit to that, or if we can move on to another question.
Hi, thank you. So I did my gender mainstreaming analysis research at the Department of Environmental Affairs and Development Planning, Western Cape government specifically. For one of the reasons why I did it there was also because the recent report showed that the policies and strategies planning were gender blind or gender neutral. And so also in terms of representation, so for instance, like one woman was holding like a chief executive officer role at that point. So things like that. So so while I was conducting my research, I also joined the gender mainstreaming forum meetings, and so I think they've already produced an output report which focuses on gender mainstreaming in the climate change response as well. I think it was developed this year. I'm not sure if it's made publicly available already. And so, so they've recognized the gap in the work. And so the person that's leading the work is Scott and Shabby. She's a passionate gender. And so, so I think they've made great strides in that respect. So I'm not sure what the data here dates back to for the research we've done for that report, but I think most recently there has been some improvement in that regard. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing that. I think, I mean, I for one, but probably other people would be interested in sharing your research and the developments happening in the Western Cape on that front. So maybe we can continue this conversation offline after the event, if you're happy with that. Let me go back to the trail of so also with regards to the issue of participation and trust, that sort of underscores maybe the problem of mainstreaming and lack of women representation in decision making when it comes to climate response. Tiki was saying trust has always been an enormous problem, and it almost seems unsurmountable to build trust, as we need to start somewhere. And I guess the $1 million question is, where is that somewhere? So it's a very open question. I think a lot of the discussions that we had with the panelists talked about engaging, educating, and capacitating girls. but also involving people in a meaningful way, and especially women in decision-making from the onset. So it's a much broader issue than just climate justice and feminist action. It looks at, citizen action and public participation. But I think some of the answers were provided. I don't know if any panelists wants to take that question. Where do we start to rebuild and strengthen trust? Feel free to shoot if you want to take that. Okay, no volunteers. I guess it's a tricky one. So we'll move on. There was a question about climate justice and sexual rights and health for women and girls. I don't know. The question is, what are we doing on that front and where it intersects? I don't know if one of our panelists would like to comment on that. How do we, what is going on, and what are we doing to address climate justice and sexual rights and health in connection to one another?
I'll attempt to do something there. It's not a lot, there's still a lot to be done, at least in our work. What has happened, and we saw that as an opportunity, that women has got some things that they can win, women and girls. And one of the issues that have been at least in our areas, is the issue of disposable nappies and disposable sanitary pads, and communities finding that all over, in one way or the other, and seeing that as an issue to be addressed in their local communities. It's been very interesting that girls and women in communities, they seem to see that as an area that they can win, because that is a female waste, that's how they have classified it. And so they see that it's their role to make sure that communities are not finding themselves in the middle of that waste. So as I say, it's still at a very, we haven't done it in many other areas, it's still in those few communities. And we hope that that model of female waste, as something that women and girls can tackle in any other community, to make sure that we keep our environment, and especially our water, because that is where it became a problem, when you find those being dumped in the water sources, wetlands, rivers, and springs. So it is just an idea that I think other people might feel like it's important. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sibongile. I'll try to take a few more questions. I'm mindful of our time. Maybe I'll leave the comments because I think we can all see them. There was, Shamila also raised the question of key messages that should be communicated to young girls who want to go into climate change work, job, careers. And Simbongile did say that leadership is valid today and in the future, and careers related to climate change adaptation and mitigation are open to girls and women today. So that's also one way to encourage them, as professionals in those fields. Let me see.
Well, if I could just add one point to that there.
Go for it.
One thing I just want to really add in emphasis to that is key messages would be, and I've noticed it a lot with the young women that we work with and the young girls, and I say girls and women because it's two separate, not separate necessarily, but let me start my video, sorry. It's two separate kind of demographics that you've got to look into. I think in the kind of incorporation or the capacitation of young girls, we need to realize that there is a confidence building facet that needs to really be pushed forward. Oftentimes, when it comes to kind of young women and young girls coming into the climate justice space, it can be so dominated once again by men, to a point where when the norm happens, it's like, literally, I was having a conversation this morning with one of the young activists, or like a young girl, and she was telling me about, like, no, it's fine, it's completely fine, I'll do it another. No, it's not fine. We need to move past this norm of these barriers that are existing in the climate justice space for years being normal. It's not normal. And it's okay to say it's not normal. It's okay to feel as though it's unjust, because it is unjust. And I think in that kind of, the key messaging would be building confidence and capacity to speak up and speak out on those feelings, understanding that these feelings of things not being right is valid, more than valid, and that being vocal is actually the most powerful thing you can do. But then surrounding that, also having anyone who isn't a girl speak out against the issues that they see in the space as well. I think silence is equally equivalent to the actual issue at hand, because it ushers in an atmosphere that is, we are all too familiar with being complacency. Yeah, I think that's all I've got to add to that point, but I really just wanted to emphasize it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Like you said, we need to shift mindsets, and there's a need of system change across all those lines. I would like maybe to take a few raised hands. I see there are Lulama, Nelly, and Gregory. So maybe I'll just take them in that order before we wrap up the Q&A and the discussion. I would, so I'll take it. Maybe Lulama, you want to go ahead? And if you can switch on your video, if it's possible, it would be great.
Thank you very much. Lulama here. I am co-convener of the feminist movement leadership. The reason why I'm here is because this action coalition speaks even much closer to my heart as an activist in climate change matters, particularly from the comment that I made, just to underscore the importance of collaboration and partnerships. And I would kindly encourage that this action coalition probably get someone that can look very closely at Laudato Si, LADATO. It is the second encyclical of Pope Francis, which basically speaks to care of our common home. And because the Pope critiques consumerism and irresponsible development, laments environmental degradation and global warming, and calls all people of the world to take swift and unified global action, it is a very, very good starting point to bring others in the discussion. And as I said, unfortunately, I couldn't be in two coalitions in one. So I would strongly encourage that someone within this coalition look at that, because it does bring forth a lot of other important issues that can be, beef up or, literally, assist in some aspect that looks at what can be done from a point of collaboration and partnerships, and also to conclude that SAFCIA, SAFCIA, that I have included in my chat box there, is an organization that we can partner with. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lulama, for sharing this. I don't know if it's your microphone or there's a phone ringing in the background. Okay, thank you. Thanks for this. I'll quickly give a chance to Nelly and Gregory to take the floor. So Nelly, if your hand is raised, can you please, yeah, we see you, thank you.
Thank you very much, Noel, and thanks to all the speakers and the conveners of this beautiful event. You know, in most cases as women, we always find ourselves as an afterthought. And I like what Gabriel said, and I completely, you know, it resonates with my beliefs. The narrative needs to change. It is time. The struggle needs to end. We can't keep doing the aluta continua. The struggle needs to end at some point. Women are not rocks. The first narrative that we need to change is the Mbogodo narrative. Women are not rocks, women are human. And I don't feel ashamed to say, I am not a Mbogodo. When you stab me, you get blood. I'm not a stone. And moving along from that point, I just needed to find out, especially from Mr. Mugwebo and somebody else who comes from government, that why is it that the Department of Small Business Development does not support women who are interested in sustainable businesses, such as the energy? That's one. There's nothing wrong with women who are doing catering, who are knitting and all of that, but businesses such as energy, if you want to do electricity generation, especially right now in an era where we're looking at climate change, for instance, there's waste management that must come into play. There's waste processing, there's recycling, and all of those things. If we then start looking at those solutions and create, especially in South Africa, where we have issues with ESCOM and load shedding and all of that, create sustainable solutions, then I think government departments should work hand in hand. You shouldn't be sent from pillar to post and be told that, no, you actually need to go to DMRE for this, we don't deal with that. And then lastly, I just want to find out, how do women get access to lend and support from government to be able to start and run these? I'm not going to call them projects, because a project is something that has a lifespan. Run these sustainable programs and make sure that young girls who are growing up in this country have some sort of a swifter entry into the economy, and more, less bumpier than what we are currently experiencing as today's women. How can we get these access to these resources from our government to make sure that we are supported and we make a way for the young girls who are growing up? And also, how do we make sure that dealing with climate change as we are approaching COP26, we know that we have been excluded in the NDC and all of that, but how do we ensure that the BBEE mistakes don't repeat themselves right now when we're dealing with the climate change response in terms of exclusion? Thank you.
Wow, that's a lot of questions. Thank you so much for that, Nelly. Maybe in a really a short answer, maybe to give a chance to Tivu. I know he touched on some of it in terms of economic participation of women. Maybe if you just want to give a short line of answer, and I know it's not going to be sufficiently satisfactory, but I just want to give a chance to Gregory, and then we will have to wrap up. So Tivu, if you're still with us, would you like to take that question? Thank you.
Thank you, Program Director. I think it's a valid question, more especially on the issue on why the Department of Small Business Development is not supporting the enterprises that are owned by women in renewable energies. And then that's one of the area where, as the department, we are working with the Department of Small Business and Small Business Development to ensure that enterprises that are owned by women, youth, and persons with disabilities do get funding, on different initiatives. Like, for instance, I was happy when Sibongile was talking about the issue of, clean waste management, because as the department, we have been working with the Department of Small Business in identifying enterprises that are owned by women that are manufacturing the sanitary towels for women, because that's one of the areas that we took as the department to say that as government is distributing the sanitary towels to indigent women in all the provinces, we want women-owned and women-led entities to be the one that produces, to be the one that supply, to be the one that are also involved in all the value chain system, to waste management, in order to ensure that women benefit out of this. I think that has been one of the areas that I've been emphasizing when I was talking, to say that we need to look at the economic benefits for women. Hence, I said that the DTIC, the small business, and the National Treasury should have been part of this conversation, because they have a critical and central role. But being that as it may, as the Department of Women, we do have a memorandum of understanding of agreement with the Department of Small Business to say that we need to ensure that we support and we do provide funding for entities that are owned by women. And then if you come to the Department of Women, we shouldn't be saying we are referring you back to the Department of Small Business and Administration. Most of the time we do also provide the opportunities for enterprises, training opportunities, to say, how do you get access to opportunities, incentives that are managed by this department, the small business or the DTIC. And then if we do have, I think, your contacts, and then we have you on the database, when we do have such opportunities, we should be able to extend the invitation to your entity to say that these are the opportunities that the small business and administration will be providing. Sometimes it will be information session on how to access certain incentive schemes and certain funding and what are the requirements. And then those are the kind of things that we are working in collaboration as government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tivo, for this. I think we'll find it useful to know about this support providing to women and people with disabilities-owned enterprises, and the fact that the department takes an active role in making that happen together with the Department of Small Businesses. I think one way to make sure that you reach out to the biggest number possible is to share that information in many platforms. This is one. So feel free to communicate any further information that could be of use to our participants that we can disseminate afterwards. I think that will be very appreciated. I will take the last hand before we wrap up the Q&A with Gregory. I don't know if your question has been answered or if you still want to come in, and can you please keep it short? We are running a bit behind. So yeah, please just a short one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair, for that. I think there's a number of things we have been said, but let me come into the space of climate change and justice as well. When you start looking into the Northern Cape and other countries, we realize that we have become the sub and a half of solar energy. But when you look into the empowerment format as well, that none of these plants are actually being owned by any women in a country, and that's a big concern about it. And we've also become what we call that the digging of holes by mining sectors where rehabilitation is not taking its course. And there's a lot of forms of empowerment that you can see into women when awareness as well that in community level needs to engage, where young women can become then the trainees to be empowered further. I think the question I'm going to pose to you today is that why can't we look into the base of local government that strategies needs to be developed and that communities in local government level must be given the powers then to start holding these mining houses accountable and these solar energy plants accountable, in seeing to that an empowerment format and the design of that empowerment format should not be cosmetic, but it should be real empowerment through the use of skills transfer and ownership of these areas of development, especially on solar energy, because a lot of billions has been spent in this province, over 40 billion has been spent in this province. And today that nothing of those billions actually, it's in the hands of young Black entrepreneurs and young Black women as well.
Thank you very much, Gregory, for bringing also the question to, local and provincial levels. And I think there are lots of things that can be done there. And yeah, the issue of skills transfer, I think this resonates with what was said before about capacitating women and girls as opposed to empowering them. But yeah, I think it's, you need opportunities, but you also need to allow the women and girls to have the capacities and the resources, the skills to seize those opportunities. So I think there's scope for a lot of work to be done to improving what the initiatives that are in place. Yeah, I think this is a lot of food for thought, and I hope we can continue those conversations and exchanging those ideas and working together to make them happen. I will close the Q&A now. And before I give the floor to Zandile Bangu from DERCO, who will offer us the closing remarks for this webinar, I just would like to invite you to check what my colleague Audrey-Anne posted on the chat. There is a link to a form, and we would like to invite those of you who have further comments or suggestions, and most importantly, would like to keep in touch to take this work forward. We talked a lot about partnership and networking, and this webinar is certainly not an end in itself. We hope it's going to be the beginning of something. So please, if you are interested in continuing conversation and working further on this with others and with us, I invite you to fill out the form. The link is in the chat. I will circulate it as well by email, but please do so. This will be a way for us to keep in touch. That being said, I will give the floor to Zandile. Yeah, I would like to thank everyone who's been attending and participating actively in this session. It's been most informative and stimulating also to hear all the voices that we had today. Thank you, Zandile. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I seem to be having connectivity issues. So with your permission, I would like to switch off my camera and just continue with just my voice. Thank you. Thank you, Noel, our esteemed moderator, distinguished guests and panelists, ladies and gentlemen. It is such a great honor for me to give concluding remarks. I would like to thank the participants for such an enriching and stimulating discussion, which is only the beginning of our 5-year journey. At the outset, it is important to state that South Africa strongly believes in the primacy of multilateralism in ensuring the full implementation of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Last year, we finalized our National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy, coordinating adaptation across action at all levels of government. We also adopted a low emissions development strategy in pursuit of a just transition to a low carbon, sustainable and climate resilient development pathway. Today, we've heard from very capable speakers who took us not only through the policy framework that South African government has developed, but also we're challenged in terms of some of the questions and the gaps that we identified in these policies, as well as the implementation of these policies. We heard from Ms. Funanin, who shared with us the strides made by the South African government, including the plan to develop National Action Plan on Climate Change and Gender. She highlighted the importance of equality and equity in policy frameworks aimed at addressing climate change. I was particularly pleased to hear about the space for dialogue that has been created by the department through the Coordinators Forum to ensure gender mainstreaming, sharing of best practices, and awareness creation. We also heard from Mr. Tivu from the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities, who underscored that the exclusion of women and girls in the climate discussions is not only undemocratic, but it also questions the legitimacy of the solutions we come up with, since women constitute more than 51% of the population. The dependence on natural resources by women and girls in rural areas necessitates that government policies address the lived experiences of women and girls, taking into account their diversity. Productive resources is one of the key pillars of the Economic Justice and Rights Action Coalition that South Africa is co-leading at global level. And this point was amplified by Mr. Tivu, who underlined the importance of women's access and ownership of land as mitigating factor in climate change responses, as well as gender mainstreaming. Furthermore, he reminded us that our climate change response should have economic benefits for women and girls, and I couldn't agree more. We also heard from Ms. Bongile Mtungwa, who reminded us that climate change is not and should not be an abstract concept, but a lived reality for many women and girls, from their access to clean water to their ability to farm. The preservation of indigenous knowledge and experience of indigenous women in particular are important. She implored on us to be inclusive in our approach, taking into account linguistic diversities of South Africa. And this point reminded me of my time when I started in the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, which was in 2011. The very first assignment was the Climate Gender Summit that was hosted by DERCO. We had women from all over the continent, and everyone understands that if there's one thing that remains the biggest legacy of colonialism in Africa is the language barrier. However, these women, the language barrier did not stop them from coming to participate and share their own indigenous knowledge and solutions to climate change before we had our COP17. So this point resonated very well with me, and as a government employee and a negotiator at global level on such issues, this is very important to make sure that not only are we speaking big at global level, but also we can be able to make sure that the knowledge gets to the grassroots level where it is needed the most. Panelists underscored that climate change is not gender neutral, and that inequalities in South Africa exposes those living in poverty more to climate change due to lack of access to basic services and needs. We were cautioned against addressing gender justice from a silo approach, and that it must be addressed from an economic, social, and sustainable development perspectives. The emphasis on intersectional and intergenerational approach to policy is critical to understand that women are affected in different ways due to their unique experiences. Meaningful and deliberate participation of women and girls in policy-making space to ensure ownership was another critical point raised. We also heard that our climate response should not only be gender sensitive, but be human rights based for a holistic approach. The call for investing in renewable energies was clear. Not only will it address climate change, but also other socioeconomic needs such as gender-based violence, sustainable agriculture, and community development. To enhance our ambition and achieve our climate goals, We need greater cooperation between governments, communities, civil society, philanthropic organizations, international institutions, and private sector. In this regard, South Africa joined forces with other global players, as it was alluded to by Ms. N at the beginning of this session, under the banner of Generation Equality Forum. Just this past July, President Ramaphosa joined other global leaders to make commitments that are aimed at the empowerment of women and girls. And this Paris conference also adopted what she also referred to earlier on as the Global Acceleration Agenda. This agenda has the 6 thematic areas she highlighted that include, in addition to the 6 action areas, we also have the Compact on Women, Peace and Security, as well as humanitarian action. The 6 action coalitions, while tackling different thematic areas, are in the main interrelated and interconnected, as we had today. We are all familiar with the impact climate change has on peace and security, irregular migration, unprecedented drought and floods, which South Africa has not been spared from. We realize that women and girls are disproportionately affected by climate change due to mostly the burden of unpaid care work that they do, resulting from social patriarchal norms, as was rightly pointed out by Amy. It therefore makes sense that women and girls are at the center of climate discussions if we are to achieve climate justice and gender-sensitive solutions. Their voice is crucial in our effort to find sustainable solutions. And just to come back to the Action Coalition and the Global Acceleration Plan that was adopted in Paris, it outlines 4 important commitments. It envisages that by 2026, there should be increase the percentage of global climate financial flows, public and private, directed towards the invested in gender just climate solutions, in particular at grassroots and rural levels, including through an increased to 88% in the proportion of marked climate bilateral finance targeted towards gender. Number 2, increase the proportion of women and girls in decision-making and leadership positions throughout environmental, government, and sectors relevant for transitioning to an inclusive, secular, and regenerative green economy by 2026. Number 3, enhances and leverage the capacity of millions more women and girls in all their diversity to build resilience to climate and disaster risk, mitigate climate change, and address loss and climate damage, including through the provision of quality education, community-based cooperative models, and land rights and tenure security. And this point was emphasized in today's discussion, of course, being pertinent since South Africa is still grappling with its own land restitution. And lastly, but not least, by 2026, at least 20 countries demonstrate increased use of gender environment statistics for policy making by creating an enabling environment for an increased production of gender environment statistics. This issue, or this point, was raised by our speakers today, that if we do not even know what we are talking about, if we do not have the necessary statistics of women who are affected by climate change, it will make our solutions and our policies to not be effective in addressing climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, South Africa is fully committed to enhancing its ambition and accelerating its climate action. It is for this reason that we established a multi-stakeholder forum to allow discussion and propel action along the 7 thematic areas of collaboration, as was highlighted earlier on. We have an action coalition that focuses on climate change, and I would like to extend an invitation to those working in the climate justice space to join us as we define South Africa's path to accelerate action for the next 5 years for the betterment of the lives of women and girls, in particular those living in poor areas as well as rural areas. In the spirit of leaving no one behind, we are particularly calling on young people and grassroots women whose voices are crucial in policy development and implementation to come and collaborate with us in this journey. Government does not have all solutions, as it has been clear over the years, and that is why we have extended the table to share best practices with those who have the know-how, who have been working in this space. We need private sector to play its role in climate justice in a meaningful way, but equally important, the role of civil society in advocacy is crucial to holding all the players, including government, accountable. From this point onwards, starting from September, at the global level, we will be embarking on developing the accountability framework that would make sure that all these commitments that were made in Paris, including by the South African government and other role players in the country, are actually implemented, and we can actually hold all the stakeholders accountable. So it is even more crucial to have all the stakeholders, including the participants we had today, joining us in coming up with our own framework or influencing what will be happening at a global level, to make sure that this does not become another framework, as it was rightly put, that we have a plethora of frameworks that have not been implemented. So once again, I would like to extend an invitation, and our contacts are available. We are ready to share through UN Women, through the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, as well as Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disability. Without any further ado, I would like to once again thank all the participants who have stayed with us for the entire 3 hours as we try to just find solutions and bring issues into this much needed debate. And thank you so much, Madam Chair. I will be handing over to you.
Thank you very much, Sandile. And I think this closes our discussion very nicely with an invitation in a very concrete way to partner and collaborate and provide input on this accountability framework, which indeed will be very important to track and check what's happening with the commitments that are made. So please, it would be appreciated if any information you have can be shared, and then we'll pass it on to those who are interested. I will close the event. Thank you very much for everyone who participated. It's been a wonderful discussion and very nice to see many people from various spaces and areas and age groups represented. I hope we will take the conversation further, and that collaborations will emerge out of it. Please refer to the link that was shared in the chat and will be circulated by email if you want to continue being involved. We sure hope that there will be a number of you responding positively to the invitation. Thank you very much. Thank you to the speakers and panelists and to the partners that have organized this event. Goodbye.